is the 6th in our series of 9. But don't worry if you've missed any on our website, the slides and or the videos of the previous sessions are there. So do have a look. We'll show, well, there you go, the website's in front of you. And we'll show the website for the incubator at the end. So the aim of this series is particularly for beginners. Maybe you've done some teaching but not actually done any educational research, and just to get started, as the label says on the tin, and just a few, with a limited time, but just an opportunity to just share some thoughts about some of the important topics in getting started in educational research. As I said, the sessions are recorded. If you don't mind, there will be a bit of a chance towards the end of the session to have some time in a small breakout group doing an exercise, but also find out who else is around and who else has attended. But it's helpful for us just to get a feel of who people are, where they're from, and you may be as nosy as I am. So if you don't mind, in the chat box, just popping your name, what your role is and where you work, that will be really interesting for us. But otherwise, I will pass over to Megan. No worries about having your cameras on during the talk, but if during the breakout groups everyone could put the cameras on, that's great. It's just a bit more polite and nice to see who you're talking to, but don't worry about it during the slides. And it's great to have a Megan, this is actually the second session she's done, so thank you very much indeed, Megan, and over to you.
Thanks, Hugh. Yeah, brilliant. So welcome everyone. Thanks for attending over your lunch break. My name is Megan Brown. I'm a Senior Research Associate in Medical Education at Newcastle University, and I'm also involved with the Incubator for Clinical Education Research, which is hosting this webinar. And with Hugh, we've pulled together this Getting Started in Qualitative Analysis session. So just to give you a kind of brief overview of what we're going to cover today, it is sort of beginners, entry level. So apologies if you do already know any of this, but I mean, even I have quite a lot of experience in qualitative analysis, and I often find that hearing someone else speak about it, even at an entry level, can be actually quite helpful because people think about things in different ways. So we're going to cover what qualitative analysis is, the key principles, think about common types of analysis within clinical education research and how they are used, briefly touch on quality within analysis, and then end the session by signposting you to some top tips and further reading, and have hopefully a little bit of time for a Q&A, but it depends slightly on how much I end up speaking. So qualitative analysis, people do have different definitions of just what qualitative analysis is, but the sort of general feeling when you look at the literature is that it's a process of deconstruction and reconstruction of data. So you move from data that you've collected, and some of you might have attended the data collection session that was the last in this series, into some form of explanation of what that means, some sort of understanding or interpretation that relates back to your research question that will help you to answer that question. And to do that, you have to break the data down to deconstruct it. You have to reconstruct it into some sort of descriptions and explanation, kind of analytic thought, and then you have to interpret that in light of the research question that you have that's of interest. This is just a sort of formal quote that says exactly that, that we interpreted on the previous slide. But you'll see here, this is kind of a useful reference. Analysis is the breaking up, separating or disassembling of research materials into various units. And that does make it more manageable. I think that's a really important point in this quote. It's manageable pieces that allows you to sort of sift and sort. And you're looking for patterns. That's another key word in this quote is patterns, so things that are repeating, things that you think, oh, I've seen that somewhere else in the data, and that's how you're able to then kind of reconstruct in this way where the data becomes connected with other pieces of data from other transcripts or survey responses or whatever it is that your data is. There are a few sort of key principles of qualitative analysis. It can be used in quite a lot of different ways, and you might have seen that the different ways that qualitative analysis can be used. Can be used to describe phenomena. So it might be your intention, you might set out wanting to just have a very rich description of something. So for example, so I mostly work in medical education. You might be interested in describing how medical students transition to their work as doctors. So you might want to describe what that process and experience is like. Or you might be interested in generating theory. This can be particularly relevant if you're working in an area where there's not much existing understanding of a topic or of why something happens. So you might identify a real gap in the literature that you then think actually the purpose of this analysis is to create theory, to create explanation. Understanding, I think the important thing to draw attention to is that although we have often quite systematic frameworks for qualitative analysis, it's not linear. It's not straightforward to kind of conduct a qualitative analysis. It can be quite messy, and you can find yourself sort of oscillating between different stages of analysis. So although, you know, when you read a research paper, when you read a paper in a journal, the analysis process is very neatly described, and you think, oh gosh, isn't it wonderful that they were able to do that in that order and to be that sort of systematic about it? In reality, it's a much messier process, in my experience. Although we do try and follow, we have these kind of guides essentially to prevent us from getting too lost in the mess. There've been previous sessions about kind of different research paradigms. If that's not a term that you're familiar with, do go back and have a look at sessions from earlier in this series. But it's also important for qualitative analysis that you're clear from what perspective you're approaching it, because how you view the world in terms of your paradigm that you're working within will influence how you look at, make sense of, and interpret that data. So interpretivist paradigms for qualitative analysis are most common. And just as a recap, they state that people differ in their experiences of understandings and reality. There's not one single verifiable reality. But realist approaches are also gathering pace, and you might have seen some realist research which sort of states that there is an objective reality, but we interpret it through subjective lenses. Both of those approaches are sort of united in a way through saying that the understanding is subjective, and that there might be multiple understandings of something. They just sort of differ on whether or not they think those multiple understandings become multiple realities, or they're multiple understandings of one reality. So that there are differences, but it's important to just think about that before, you know, that should be, as we've said in earlier sessions, an early consideration before you move into data collection and analysis. Simply, the aim of qualitative analysis is to simplify your data. You will have a lot of data, even if you only have, you know, a few interviews or some survey responses, you'll still find that it's a lot to handle. There are a lot of different avenues that you could go down, a lot of different kind of even questions that might become apparent and that you might identify within the data that you could explore. And you want to remove the noise. You want to focus in on what is going to help you to answer your research question. And really important is also telling a compelling story. A research paper, you want that to be engaging and compelling. You want the results to tell a story, and the story can't be too complicated. It has to be, you know, logical and easy to follow, and leave readers with a kind of clear sense of what that take-home message, what the key driving force of that story is. There are also differences between inductive, deductive, and abductive reasoning, which kind of play into these, are all sort of principles that you might bring into qualitative analysis, different approaches that you might use. Again, you might have encountered these previously, but I find it can be quite challenging to kind of continually remember and distinguish between these different definitions. So inductive reasoning within qualitative analysis would mean that we're generating those new theories, and they're very grounded in the observations that we have made and the data that we have collected during the research process. Whereas a deductive approach would be starting with a very specific idea, so a hypothesis that you're testing, maybe even a specific educational theory that you're looking to test within your setting or your context, and you're gathering the data to test that idea or that theory, and you're going to end with confirming or kind of throwing out and saying that that doesn't actually work. So that would be more of a deductive approach. And then abductive, which I think is actually the one that we see most commonly within clinical education research. You might begin with some incomplete observations or data. So you might have looked at other studies that have shown XYZ about something, or there might be a theory that you think maybe could work, or there might be several theories that you think actually bits of those different theories, they feel like they might be relevant. And you might have some observations based on your own personal experiences of clinical practice or of lived experience. And you make an explanation, a possible explanation out of what you already have. And then you look at your data and you have this kind of back and forth process between the observations and the theory that you've come in with and the empirical, the kind of the grounded data that you're collecting from participants, and your kind of final qualitative analysis is a kind of a mixture of insights. You've used theory, you've used your previous observations to interpret, but you're also remaining very sensitive to the data and grounded in what the data is telling you. So it's not purely deductive. So it's kind of a middle ground, abductive between inductive and deductive. This is quite a nice diagram. I'm not going to dwell on this just in the interest of time, but it does sort of demonstrate how inductive at the bottom of these arrows it comes from observations, it comes from theory. You're building towards the support for theory, sorry, and the hypotheses that you might be made, whereas deductive is this kind of top-down approach, and then the abductive arrows are kind of in the middle between the grounded observations from inductive and the top-down hypotheses and theory from deductive approaches. So I'm not going to dwell too much on that. It is a slightly complicated diagram, but if anyone does have any questions, we can dig into that a little bit further later. Just to take you through common types of analysis, there are many, and these are not all of the types of analysis that we use within clinical education research. They're just the ones that I feel that I see the most in terms of looking at journals and projects that people bring. I'll give you a sort of brief recap of each of these, but we're not going to focus on all of them today, just that there wouldn't be time. So thematic analysis, this is the one that we're going to go into and focus on later in this session, is about looking for those patterns or themes within data and interpreting in light of your kind of research question the meaning of those themes. A framework analysis, a content analysis, sorry, next on the list, not framework analysis, a content analysis is more focused on a description. It's more descriptive of the content that you have. People might count content, count kind of frames or codes that they create. A framework analysis has a very systematic process of sifting and charting and sorting material according to key issues and themes. And you use a predefined framework to do that. There are elements of deductive analysis and inductive analysis within that. Grounded theory is very common. The focus is creating theory in areas where there isn't much literature, there aren't many explanations. And it involves looking at the data to generate that theory that's grounded in that empirical data. Phenomenological analysis focuses on studying how individuals experience and understand phenomena. It's about lived experience through deep engagement with participants and their descriptions and experiences. Case study research is a very in-depth approach that you might have seen, involving a kind of a detailed look at the context of a single event, a situation, an institution or an individual over time, and you get a real kind of complex understanding of those issues in kind of very real life practical settings. Discourse analysis and narrative analysis are kind of a bit more complex and are probably slightly less common. So I wouldn't worry too much. Narrative analysis being quite focused on stories, the stories that people tell when you kind of prompt them and you facilitate that in quite a loosely structured way. And discourse analysis looking for kind of popular ideas, discourses within the narratives that people give. That's a bit of a whistle-stop tour. There's a lot of information there, but essentially we're going to focus on thematic analysis. This is a common approach in the field. It's also quite a good way to get started because there is quite a lot, it's popular, so there's quite a lot of guidance out there on how to go about conducting a thematic analysis. And it blends, you know, kind of elements of being more analytical, and you can use it quite flexibly in quite a loose way to explore things in a very inductive way, or you can use it to explore things in a more kind of structured and systematic way. So there are various ways in which you can apply and use this, which is particularly useful for different projects that have different needs. So as I said, it's methodologically flexible, means you can use it with, you know, we had a getting started in choosing a methodologies webinar that I did. You can use it in essentially any of those methodologies, as long as you're considering how it fits in terms of the paradigm that you're approaching thematic analysis from and the paradigm of your methodology. It involves identifying patterns within qualitative data. And one specific type of thematic analysis that you might see spoken about that is particularly popular is reflexive thematic analysis. And Brown and Clark are the kind of the progenitors of that approach. And there's a lot of clear guidance on reflexive thematic analysis. And I'm going to just take you through a few of those different ideas and resources here. So these are the two sort of key texts that I would turn to. There are a lot out there about thematic analysis and reflexive thematic analysis, but I find these particularly helpful and useful. So hopefully you'll have access to these through your institutions. And they're both books by Brown and Clark. And they were developed to address inconsistencies in thematic analysis. So because it is such a methodologically flexible approach, it's such a popular approach. People were using it in all sorts of different ways before this guidance came out. It was very variable what people were labeling as thematic analysis, and it sort of was beginning to raise questions as to the quality of that work, how trustworthy that work was. You know, could we base change in practice on that research? Reflexive thematic analysis operates within a constructivist and interpretivist paradigm because it acknowledges the researcher's active role in interpretation. You're not a passive entity as a researcher within this approach to an analysis. You are actively involved in constructing themes. You bring your own experiences and background and opinions and thoughts to that analytic process. And it is, as I said, very flexible across different data types. You can use this interviews, you know, focus groups. You know, you've seen people use it for surveys, audio diaries, all sorts of different data that you might have, and methodologies that data has been collected within, as long as you have that alignment within that kind of broadly interpretivist paradigm. It's really well suited for research because of that, involving subjective data, where you're interested and you're going to embrace the fact that the experiences, beliefs, values, and thoughts might differ. And in identifying and in helping you to interpret those patterns that will lead you back to an answer to that kind of compelling and relevant story that helps you to answer your research question. There are several key steps, and I am going to run you through these with some visual representations to break it down a little bit in more detail. But here are them in full. And if you want to watch the webinar back or take the slides, then this might be a helpful slide. But these are the sort of 6 steps that that Brown and Clark recommend: familiarization, data coding, generating initial themes, reviewing and developing themes, refining, defining, and naming the themes, and producing the report. And as I said, we'll go through it. This appears very systematic and logical, and it is, but in practice, there is movement between these stages often, and you might go back and you might redo something before bringing it forwards again. So the first step, I'm going to walk you through these kind of key steps in reflexive thematic analysis now. And the first step is this familiarization. So this essentially means getting familiar with your data. If you have data in the form of an audio file, so say, for example, you've done an online interview or a focus group, and you have the audio from the Teams call or whatever it is that your Zoom call, whatever it is that you've used. Transcribing them yourself is actually, it's time consuming. I know it can be difficult, but transcribing them yourself can actually be a really good way to begin to get familiar with the data. You're hearing it over again. You might have the interviews, the facilities and the resources to get those interviews transcribed by somebody else. And if you do, you're going to need to read and reread and keep reading through these transcripts. And although you're not documenting sort of formally any codes at this point, we'll go through what a code is in a minute. You might want to start thinking about what your early observations are about the data, what's your kind of gut feeling about what's happening and what might be meaningful, about patterns that you might be beginning to see. Jotting down those thoughts as reflective memos, you might call them, memo making, you might see mentioned, can be useful just to sort of keep track of those early thoughts. And sometimes they can be helpful to come back to. Later stages, you can start to feel a little bit lost in the data, and coming back to what you thought early on in the process, what you thought was important on a first read, can be helpful. And it can also be helpful when you're coming to write this data up in a research paper. Maybe you're doing a dissertation or a thesis, in which case you need to keep a really clear track, a really clear audit trail of those different steps. So keeping those reflective memos, you can do them in the margins of the transcripts, but they're relatively easy lost. You might want to get a little journal, paper journal, or jot them down somewhere on your computer. And I would just try to keep track of those. Creating the initial codes, that's the next step. And what you're looking to do now that you're familiar with the data, you have a sense of what is in each of your various transcripts. You want to create an initial set of codes that break down that data to represent the meanings and the patterns that you saw there in the data. And a really, one helpful way of doing this, you might create a code book. Not everybody does. You don't have to create a code book within reflexive thematic analysis. It's one way to keep track of your codes, is to have a list. Essentially, a code book is a list of your codes with a description of what each of those codes means, how you've applied it essentially to the data. Or you might just have transcripts where you've highlighted, you can see on a list of transcript on screen here, sections in yellow relate to this code, you might have sections in green relating to a different code, and you might do that manually. And again, there are software where you can do that electronically as well. But you're breaking down the data, and the codes are very descriptive. If you can, try to use the language of the participants when it comes to the code. So if you can use their own words to create a code name, that's great. If not, try to keep it very, very descriptive in terms of what is being said, the content of that code. And where you identify similar excerpts or sections of the transcript, they should have the same code applied. So you do need to think a little bit about how you're applying the code and making sure that you have an understanding in the descriptions of the code when you would and when you wouldn't apply that code. The next step is essentially to bring the codes together with some supporting data. So group the codes, the excerpts that are associated with particular codes. You'll see various ways of doing this. If you're using a pen and paper, you might cut out sections of transcripts and kind of physically group them together by code. If you're using a software, you can do that electronically. Some AI within software claim to be able to do this now. I've not really tested it, but it's an interesting avenue. But to be able to essentially collate and compile all of the pieces of your data across all of the transcripts that you have with various codes to make sure that you've got that breadth. So, you're not missing anything. You've been sort of comprehensive in your coverage and within your coding. You can then begin to group the codes into themes. So what you'll see here is these themes are these kind of umbrellas within which you might have various different codes, different colored codes. And these themes are a very powerful way to see and to make apparent the trends and the patterns in your data. You might see it varies, you might have coded, you might have loads of codes. It's not unusual to have, I don't want to scare anyone, hundreds of codes for any one research project. But some of them might be similar. You'll find yourself creating, similar codes, or maybe you've used the participant's own language and it's actually the meaning is the same. So you might combine some codes together, and you might see that whether or not they group with other codes to create a theme, which we'll run through in a minute, is codes are mainly descriptive, where themes should be analytical. They should be more concerned with connections in your data that help you to tell the story that answers your research question. The next bit is reviewing and revising your themes. So you have that initial set of themes. Brilliant, you've put a lot of work into that. And now you're going to not scrap it, but you do have to go back and be quite open to changing and moving around things. You need to go back to your data, check that you have enough data to support each of the themes that you've created, that it is grounded in what your participants are saying, and that the themes are distinct from each other, that there's not too much overlap. There may be some areas of overlap. Obviously, they're going to connect to tell that story, your themes, when you come to write your narrative, but they need to be distinct so that I could tell the difference between the themes within that story. You might consider merging together themes that are similar. You might consider removing themes that don't have enough data to back them up. And you need to begin thinking about how your themes sit alongside each other. How do they connect with one another to tell that story? You probably don't want to end up with too many themes. There's no hard and fast rule about how many final themes you should have in a project. But if you have too many, the story might be too big, or your themes might be just too descriptive and not sort of high level enough. So think carefully about how many themes you're presenting and how many you need to tell the story. As we said, the aim with analysis is to simplify. You could construct a wide variety of themes to answer a wide variety of research questions, but think about the focus, keep coming back to and reminding yourself of the question that you're trying to answer. And then the last step is producing the report or writing your narrative. And it's the sort of final step in telling the story of your data. Often this gets skimmed over, I would say, within analysis. Not everybody would see writing as analysis, but it is part of that qualitative analysis process. You should at this point have fully thought out and developed themes. It's your chance to sort of communicate with your readers about those themes, and making sure that your themes tell a coherent story, that you have a description of your theme within the narrative that is supported by quotes from your data, and that those quotes are helpful exemplar quotes, that they're vivid quotes, they're powerful quotes, they're particularly important quotes, ones that stood out to you, really resonated with you or with your team when you were reading the quotes and the transcripts. The narrative should go beyond just describing the data. Again, I'm going to come back to this difference between description and analysis in a moment. They should go beyond just describing the data, and include more of those interpretive, analytical thoughts that you've had as a research team. And together, those thoughts make a kind of compelling argument for the claims that you present. When you're reading a narrative and a story, it not only needs to be coherent, but as we said, compelling. You need to be convinced as to the meaning that you've identified underlying that. So I'm going to flash up a few different examples of thematic analysis. This is quite a helpful diagram that kind of demonstrates some of those steps or phases that you might go to. So you've got your kind of raw data at the bottom as your data transcripts, kind of comes up into the descriptive codes. We haven't talked about sub-themes, but if you see sub-theme, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's kind of a theme within a theme, a mini theme, where you might have several smaller themes that connect to create a kind of higher overarching theme. You don't have to use sub-themes, is the other thing to say. Some projects will, some projects won't. You might not feel that they're relevant when you're reading, or you might feel that you really do need sub-themes. And they're kind of a middle ground between being descriptive and analytical, or they might be quite descriptive still, but not be the I'll show you in a minute, but they might not be the kind of they might not be very detailed descriptions. They might be more of a category that then leads you kind of bridges the very detailed descriptions within your codes and the higher overarching analytical themes that you construct. And this was supposed to be animated, but the way that I've shared on Zoom, it's not going to come up as that. These are very messy examples of thematic analysis. And I'm going to try and just, I'll enlarge them and then I'll delete them so that you can see them. This is one. You might create electronic thematic maps, where you connect different codes. You know, the green might be codes, for example, the blue could be some sub-themes, and the red could be a theme. There's no one right way of doing this, but just to show the purpose of these visuals is to show you that there are many ways of visually representing and going about qualitative analysis. It's not linear. Coming back to that point, that it is quite a messy and iterative process. So that would be an electronic one. This is a and the topics don't, you know, specifically matter. This person has created a table of various kind of lived experiences, various different themes with excerpts. You can see the different quotes in different colors that relate to different codes. Different people are going to make sense of data in different ways. You know, if a table works for you, maybe that's a helpful avenue to explore. A very rough map of different codes, and you can see that this person has begun to draw lines between different codes to think about how they might connect. It's another way that you could do it. This is usually the way that I do thematic analysis. It's a little old school, in a manual way without using software. And this is that point in the data analysis that we discussed earlier, where you might chop up your transcripts into different excerpts. They're underlined with your thoughts from your earlier analysis, and then you might group them. Post-it notes are a really wonderful way of doing that if it's something you have access to. And again, you can do online whiteboards, online post-it notes, because it allows you to move around. You might go, actually, that code and those quotes do not fit here anymore. I'm going to move them to this other theme until you're satisfied with that arrangement. And this is an example of coding, so that earlier stage where you might go through, underline, write your thoughts and your descriptive codes. You know, got things here, annoyances, using search, services, very kind of descriptive and grounded in the data. And this is one of those. I had a whole room that was like this when I did my thesis, in terms of chopped up excerpts and post-it notes and overarching themes. I just wanted, before we move into our activity, to think a little bit about this metaphor of buckets and diamonds and stories, and how that relates to themes. You get different types of themes. Some themes are buckets, they're topic summaries, where you have all data relevant to a topic and you chuck it in a bucket. It's very descriptive. It holds everything within that topic. Diamonds, diamond themes that you might find, diamonds in the sand, they exist in the data fully formed, people would say, if they're using this approach. People using the diamonds in the sand approach would believe that a researcher's role is to discover or to find a theme. Themes might emerge. You might see the language of emergence on their own. Stories, which I think is really what we're aiming for, in my view, when we're doing a reflexive thematic analysis, is seeing a theme as an interpretative story. It's a rich, they're multifaceted patterns. They involve shared meaning that are organized around a central concept, your research question, the phenomenon that you're interested in, or the idea that you're interested in. And they're actively created. Stories have an author. They're actively created by the researcher through that analytic engagement that you go through. And reflexive thematic analysis needs those stories. There have been a lot of people who said, you know, themes emerge. I'm going to use a diamonds in a sand approach, but it's not a good fit with an interpretivist paradigm, because you need to acknowledge the active role of the researcher, and having a stories approach helps you do that. Buckets, nothing wrong with buckets. I've constructed bucket-based themes before. They're quite an early stage of analysis. Might be appropriate in some research projects. Maybe description is what you're after. As we said before, be clear about what you're aiming for. But they're, to me, often an early stage of analysis. They're categories. They help you to move from the grounded description of your codes to connecting the buckets together to tell a story, which is the higher level kind of analytical themes. We do have a little activity now for you. Give this a go. We'll see how it is, and we'll see how. I think we have enough time to do this and do this well. The aim of the activity is to help you move from coding into themes, because I think a lot of the time what we do when it comes to activities, when I've run sessions like this before, is we focus on that first initial step, which is coding and going through a transcript and assigning descriptive labels. I think probably quite a few of us would be able to do that. The tricky bit for me is often moving from the codes, the descriptive codes, into connecting them to tell this more analytical story. So on screen are a set of coded data fragments in response to this question: how did disabled medical students experience the transition to online learning during COVID-19? Who doesn't love thinking about COVID a little bit more at this point? And there are 6 different kind of categories, I suppose, that your codes that you're grouping quotes under, and some example quotes. So we have accessibility of online platforms, it's a descriptive code, technical support and resources, adaptation to new learning formats, peer support and interaction, faculty understanding and flexibility, and mental health. So imagine you've been through the transcripts, you've got a set of transcripts, doesn't really matter how many, you've got a set of transcripts. You've been through, you've identified these 6 codes that you're seeing time and time again in your transcripts, and you've identified some quotes that fit with these codes. And what we'd like you to do is to get into small groups and to have a think about how you might move from this stage, from having codes, to developing some themes. And obviously this is artificial because it's not the full picture. You know, it's only 6 codes. There's only going to be so much that you can do here. But I wonder if you might be able to think about some small ways in which you might begin the process of connecting these themes. You're not going to come out with a fully developed, lovely, compelling analytical story, but it's the first step to trying to get you to do that as a group. Lee is hopefully going to post this into the chat, a picture of this or some text of this, so you have it in the breakout rooms.
I will try my best.
Thanks, Lee, because it'd be quite hard to do without having access to this. But I want to give you, just before we go into the breakout rooms, if you just have a couple of minutes to just look at this individually, maybe make some notes as to what your thoughts are on how these might connect, and then take it into a group discussion where you'll have about 10 minutes. That Hugh and myself can move around the rooms, but there won't be a facilitator in each room as such necessarily. And then we'll bring it back into the group discussion after that.
Okay.
Can you see that again?
Yes.
Great, thank you everyone. I know that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour. It's quite a tight session for time. And I think that we could, hopefully that's illustrated how complex this is and how much time you could spend thinking about these connections in what is seemingly a relatively descriptive and simple set of codes about online learning. And I'm not sure if we won't go into it too much, but what we sort of realized is there's lots of elements to this question. There's disability, there's online learning, there's COVID, there's transition, and how you explore each of those different areas and then begin to connect them together in a story is going to actually require quite a lot of work, and more work than what we have here. But hopefully it was beginning, helpful to hear from other people as well, how they might see connections. And everyone will see different connections in data, and that's fine. That's why we have to be reflexive within reflexive thematic analysis, which means just thinking about reflecting on our own personal experiences and backgrounds and how they influence this process. And we should be constantly doing that throughout to make that clear and apparent to a reader. How we move from a bucket to a story. So I'm not sure in the other rooms, we had some bucket themes coming out, which is great. As I said, that's a sort of first step to sorting out your patterns, to putting them into categories or to buckets. But the tricky bit in my experience is then moving from a bucket to a story. How do you do that? And these are some ways that you might think about that. You can interrogate your data further. Can you ask deeper questions of that data? So we had, some of these coded fragments. We felt like there wasn't enough information in the quotes to actually make sense of them. Why might a participant feel that way? How do those experiences relate to kind of broader contexts that you know about? What are the implications of those of that data or those findings? Can you engage with theory in that abductive back and forth approach to make sense of things? Can you consider broader context, factors in play, social factors, cultural factors that might be shaping experiences? Reflexivity, as I said, reflecting on your role, what you're bringing to the data. Why are you more likely to identify that than someone else in your group? What might you not be seeing because of your own experiences? Can you seek feedback? That's really key. Working in a team, very, very important. And try and discuss that analysis as much as you can. Maybe draw the line at, random passing strangers, but people in your team, people in your family, others that are familiar with qualitative research, anything to help you hone that story, to make it more accessible. Can your analysis be iterative? You might need to move backwards between themes, and then you might go, actually, I'm not sure that's right. I need to go back to the data. Maybe I need to take another look at this set of codes. Do they fit somewhere else? And that will help you refine the kind of summaries that you come up with. Look for contradictions in your data as well, just to say that can be quite a rich way of, what doesn't fit. Are there two participants saying completely different things? Why are they saying completely different things? Do you have one person in your data that is saying something completely different, that contradicts the theme, this beautiful theme that you've come up with, and then you'll do an interview and you'll go, that's completely different. Why is it different? Can part of that theme and that story be understanding why people might be having these different experiences, why people might be thinking in different ways? What are those broader factors? Thinking kind of creatively, I find, can help. Very biased because I'm very into creative methods, but if creativity is your thing, or you have an area of creativity that you find is helpful, that helps you think. For me, it's poetry. Other people, could be music, could be art, could be getting out in nature, going for a walk, whatever it is. If you've got something that works for you to help you think and make sense of your data, feel free to do that, to engage with that as part of the analytic process. There are lots of formal ways you can do it. You can also do it relatively informally to just sort of help you think about and make sense of your thoughts. Briefly on quality, and I'm going to skim over this, but it will be there. It's there in the full sort of slide package. These are common quality criteria that you see mentioned when it comes to qualitative analysis: credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability. Credibility, and these are sort of different factors that you might do to enhance each. Can you triangulate data, look at it from different people's perspectives? Can you can you think about reflexivity, which you're going to if you're taking a reflexive thematic approach, hopefully, auditing the process of your research to support consistency. As I said, it might be quite a back and forth process. That's absolutely fine. Don't worry if it's not straightforward. Just make sure that what you do is transparent, and it is, adhering to those kind of ethical standards that we do know about. Top tips. So just finally, to sort of wrap things up, working in a team is helpful. If you can collaborate, and especially if you can collaborate with someone who has done qualitative analysis before, that's great. Even if you're collaborating with someone and you're working it out as you go together, that's also can be very helpful, to just have another person to bounce thoughts and ideas off. Does this make sense? Is this is it a compelling story? Is it a story rather than just a description of what has happened? Does it actually tell you something about the meaning of what is happening here, about people's behavior, why they might be doing things that they're doing, why they might be feeling certain ways. Do consider your logistics, and we haven't really touched on that, but do plan for this to take quite a lot of time. Plan for this to involve managing quite a lot of data. You might have quite a big data set, and as soon as you start cutting them up, the transcripts, and moving them around, it can become quite easy to lose track of where things are from. So you will need to keep a record of that excerpt has quite clearly come from that transcript, and so do plan for that, and take your time. Be realistic with timelines. This isn't a simple cut and dry. It's not an exercise in counting beans, of counting how many times someone has said what. That's not what a reflexive thematic analysis anyway is like. It's not what most qualitative analysis is like. It does take time. Plan for reflexivity as well. So we've mentioned this briefly, keep coming back to it, but you might want to plan activities to help you think about your relation to the data, your relationship to the data and to the participants. That might be team discussions. You might keep a reflexive journal. You might do creative activities that help you consider your own position and your own identities and your relationship to the data. No one right way of doing it, but do think about it and do plan for it and do it intentionally, and give creative approaches a try, especially if you get stuck at that bucket to story phase. try to think creatively about your data, doing things like creating a poem from the data within your buckets. You know, poetry is not for everybody, but it can help you think in a kind of very focused way, and in a way that takes you beyond description, takes you into kind of playing with meaning. Any way that helps you to play with the meaning of something is helpful for you to move towards that story position. Some further reading, again, I'm not going to dwell on that, but it is there on the slides if you're interested. And just before we finish, to signpost that the next session in this series is tackling the practicalities of research, and this will include more of those logistic elements that we haven't had much time to think about today: funding, ethics, PPI, etc. And it's Hugh, who is here today, but also Katie Webb, who's an associate professor in medical education, and recently heard her speak yesterday about PPI, and can highly recommend the experiences that she's going to bring. Thank you so much for listening. I'm not sure if we have any time for questions, Hugh. I know that's run on a little bit, but back over to you.
Thanks, Megan. Yeah, what we normally do now is finish formally, and people can leave because that was the advertised time. But Megan and I will hold on for another 10 minutes or so. So if people do have questions that they would like to ask, then please do stay online, and we're happy to discuss any further questions.